The smell hit you before you walked through the gates. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and something else you couldn't identify but would never forget. You stood outside with your mother and younger brother, staring at the brick building that looked more like a prison than a place of refuge. Your father had died 3 weeks ago. Your mother had tried everything. She begged on streets, knocked on doors looking for work, sold everything you owned down to the cooking pots. Nothing had been enough. Now you were here, the workhouse, the last place anyone wanted to go, the place people spoke about in whispers, their faces tight with fear and shame. Your mother's hand trembled as she reached for the bell. You were 9 years old and you understood with cold certainty that once you walked through those gates, your life would never be the same. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't help. This was punishment for the crime of being poor. The mid to late 1700s saw workhouses spread across England like a plague. They were created under the Poor Law, supposedly to provide relief for those who couldn't support themselves. The destitute, the elderly, the sick, the orphaned, all were funneled into these institutions. But relief wasn't the real purpose. The workhouses existed to make poverty so unbearable that people would do anything to avoid them. The conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to punish rather than help. The reasoning was simple and cruel. If the poor were comfortable, they'd never try to improve their situation. So the workhouses had to be worse than the worst job, worse than starvation on the streets, worse than dying in a gutter. And they were. Families were separated the moment they entered. Men sent to one wing, women to another, children torn from their mothers and housed separately. You weren't allowed to see your family. You weren't allowed to touch them or speak to them. The authorities claimed this prevented idleness and inappropriate behavior, but the real reason was control. Broken people were easier to manage than families who still had each other. The food was deliberately insufficient. Thin gruel, stale bread, and occasionally rotted vegetables. Just enough to keep you alive, never enough to satisfy hunger. The work was brutal and pointless, breaking rocks, picking apart old rope fiber by fiber, crushing bones for fertilizer. Tasks designed to break your spirit while producing minimal value. Thomas Cooper was 11 when his family entered the workhouse in Leeds. His father had worked in a textile mill until an accident with machinery crushed his hand. Unable to work, unable to pay rent, the family had nowhere else to go. Thomas's mother carried his baby sister. His 2 other sisters, ages 7 and 9, walked beside them. They arrived on a gray morning in November. The master of the workhouse, a man named Garrett, looked them over like livestock. He didn't ask their names. He just pointed. Men's wing, women's wing, children's ward. Thomas's father tried to argue, said they needed to stay together, but Garrett just called for the porter. Thomas watched his father being led away. He watched his mother's face crumble as they took the baby from her arms. He watched his sisters cry as they were pulled in a different direction. Then rough hands grabbed him, and he was shoved down a hallway that smelled like mold and despair. He never saw his father again. The man died 6 weeks later from an infection in his hand that was never treated. Thomas didn't learn about it until 3 months after the burial. The children's ward was a large room with rows of thin mattresses on the floor. 40 boys ranging from age 5 to 14, all crammed together. There were no blankets, just rough sheets that barely covered you. The room was freezing in winter, stifling in summer. You slept pressed against other boys, stealing warmth from their bodies. The routine started before dawn. A bell rang at 5 in the morning. You had 10 minutes to use the latrine, a trench in the corner of the yard that overflowed constantly. Then you lined up for breakfast. A bowl of watery oatmeal, sometimes with weevils floating in it. You ate it anyway because there was nothing else. After breakfast came work. For the boys, that meant picking oakum. You were given old rope, thick and tarred and hard as wood. Your job was to unravel it fiber by fiber until your fingers bled. The fibers were sold to shipyards for caulking. Each boy had a quota. If you didn't meet it, you didn't eat dinner. Thomas's hands were raw within the first week. His fingertips split open. The tar got into the wounds and burned. Other boys had it worse. Some had lost fingernails. Others had infections that turned their hands black. There was no medical care. The workhouse doctor visited once a month, glanced at whoever was dying, and left. The work went on for 10 hours with a 30-minute break for lunch, more thin gruel, more stale bread, then back to the oakum until evening. There was no kindness in the workhouse. The masters and matrons were chosen specifically for their hardness. Compassion was seen as weakness, as something that would undermine discipline. Thomas learned this on his third day. A younger boy, maybe 6 years old, was crying during the work period. He missed his mother. He couldn't stop sobbing. The master, a man named Hobbs, walked over and hit the boy across the face hard enough to knock him down. Then he made the boy stand in the corner for the rest of the day without food. No one helped him. No one dared. You learned quickly that showing emotion meant punishment. Crying meant punishment. Complaining meant punishment. Even speaking could get you punished if you weren't specifically asked a question. So you stayed silent. You kept your head down. You worked until your body gave out, and then you worked some more because the alternative was worse. At night, Thomas would lie on his thin mattress and try not to think about his family. He wondered if his sisters were okay. He wondered if his mother was still alive. He had no way of knowing. You weren't allowed to send letters. You weren't allowed visitors. The workhouse was designed to cut you off from everything you known, to make you forget you ever been a person with a name and a family and a life outside these walls. If you were Thomas, ripped from your family at 11 years old, your hands bleeding from 10 hours of pointless labor, your stomach cramping from hunger, would you have kept going? Or would you have looked for a way out, even if that way out meant something desperate and final? Disease moved through the workhouse like wildfire. With so many people crammed into small, unventilated spaces, illness was constant. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, scarlet fever. Once someone got sick, it spread to everyone around them. There was no quarantine, no isolation. You just kept working and hoped you didn't catch it. Thomas watched boys die, not in dramatic ways, quietly. They'd get sick, grow weaker, stop being able to work, and within days they'd be gone. Their bodies were removed at night so the other boys wouldn't see. But you knew, you always knew, the empty space on the floor, the one less boy in line. Death was normal in the workhouse, expected. The masters didn't even seem to notice. One winter, an outbreak of fever killed 15 boys in Thomas's ward over the course of 2 months. No one investigated. No one asked questions. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the workhouse, and new inmates filled the empty spaces. Thomas got sick too, about 8 months after arriving. Fever, chills, a cough that felt like it was tearing his lungs apart. He couldn't work. He could barely stand, but there was no rest. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Simple as that. Thomas dragged himself to the oakum room and worked through the fever, his vision blurring, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the rope. He survived, barely, but the illness left him permanently weakened. His chest hurt with every breath. He coughed constantly. He was 12 years old and already felt like his body was falling apart. But here's what makes it truly horrific. The workhouses weren't underfunded or poorly managed. They were profitable. The labor of the inmates produced goods that were sold. Oakum, crushed bones, broken rocks used in construction. The workhouse masters took that money. Some of it went to operating costs, but much of it went into their own pockets. The food budget was deliberately kept low to maximize profit. The worse the inmates were treated, the more money the masters made. And this was legal. This was accepted. The poor law authorized it. Society knew the workhouses were hell, and society didn't care. In fact, that was the point. The cruelty was the policy. If the poor suffered enough, they'd be motivated to find work, to pull themselves up, to stop being a burden on taxpayers. The fact that there weren't enough jobs, that wages were too low to survive on, that poverty was often the result of circumstances beyond anyone's control, none of that mattered. Poverty was treated as a moral failing, and the workhouse was the punishment. Think about the systems that exist today to help the poor. Food assistance, housing support, unemployment benefits. Now imagine those replaced with a system designed to torture you into compliance. Imagine being told that if you need help you'll get it, but only after you've been stripped of dignity, family, and basic humanity. Would you ask for help, or would you choose to suffer in silence? Most children didn't leave the workhouse. They either died there or aged into the adult wings, where the work was even harder and the life expectancy even shorter. Thomas made it to 14. By then, he'd been in the workhouse for 3 years. He'd lost track of time. Days blended together into an endless cycle of wake, work, sleep, repeat. He hadn't seen his mother or sisters since the day they'd arrived. He didn't know if they were alive or dead. He stopped asking because asking meant punishment. Then one day, without explanation, he was told he was being apprenticed out. Workhouse children were often sold to factories or mines as cheap labor. The workhouse got paid, the employer got a worker who couldn't quit or complain, and the child had no say in the matter. Thomas was sent to a coal mine in Durham. The conditions there were somehow worse than the workhouse. He worked 12-hour shifts crawling through tunnels barely wide enough for his body, hauling coal in the darkness. The air was so thick with dust he could barely breathe. He lasted 6 months. One morning a tunnel collapsed. Thomas was inside with 3 other boys. The timbers gave way and tons of rock and coal came down. 2 boys died instantly, crushed under the weight. Thomas and another boy were trapped in a small pocket of space. They could hear men digging, trying to reach them, but it was slow work. Hours passed. The air grew thin. Thomas's companion, a boy named Jack, stopped breathing first. Thomas felt him go still in the darkness. Then Thomas closed his eyes. He didn't fight it. He just let go. He was 14 years old. His body was recovered 2 days later and buried in the mine's graveyard, a field of unmarked graves where dozens of other child workers lay. No one notified his family. No one recorded his death in any official register. He simply ceased to exist. The workhouse system continued for decades. Generations of poor families were fed into it. Children grew up inside those walls, never knowing what a normal childhood felt like. Old people died alone in crowded wards, separated from their spouses after 50 years of marriage. The sick suffered without care. The disabled were worked until they collapsed. And all of it was legal. All of it was sanctioned by law and supported by society. Because the alternative, actually helping the poor, actually addressing the systemic causes of poverty, would have required the wealthy to sacrifice some of their comfort. It would have required acknowledging that poverty wasn't a moral failing but a structural problem. And that acknowledgement would have threatened the entire social order. So the workhouses remained. The suffering continued. And the people who benefited from the system, the taxpayers who didn't have to pay higher rates, the factory owners who got cheap labor, the landlords who didn't have to worry about unpaid rent, all of them slept peacefully at night knowing the poor were being properly managed. Even after the workhouses were officially reformed in the 19th century, after public outcry forced some improvements, the damage had been done. Millions of people had already been ground through the system. Their lives had been destroyed not by personal failure but by deliberate policy. And the attitudes that created the workhouses never really disappeared. They just evolved. The belief that poverty is a character flaw, that people who need help are somehow lesser, that suffering is an acceptable price for maintaining social order. Those ideas are still here, still shaping policy, still determining who gets help and who gets abandoned. The workhouse may be gone, but its ghost remains. In every cruel policy that punishes the poor for being poor, in every system that treats human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. In every moment when society looks at someone struggling and decides they deserve it, the workhouse never really ended. It just learned to hide itself better.